Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at an example. We're going to see a lot of examples of these throughout the semester. Product rules and quotient rules are going to show up a lot. Now, I will say this, we need to get really comfortable with these, and I would say pretty quickly, because problems are not going to tell you that you should use a product rule and a quotient rule. You have to use a product rule anytime you are taking a derivative of something that has one thing times another, okay? Specifically one function times another function. If you have a constant out in front, that was our constant multiplier rule, you don't need to use a product rule in there. Although it wouldn't be wrong, it'll get you to the same spot, it's just more work than is needed. In fact, we'll see a problem like that in a minute. But let's say we have a function f of x that looks like, we'll just start fairly basic for product rule here, f of x equals x squared times e to the x, okay? And we want to know, what does the derivative of this function look like? Well, this is a product rule, not just because I'm telling you that, but because there is multiplication in there. And so we have one function times another function. And so if it would help you to label these as f and g, you can go ahead and do that. Hopefully it shouldn't take a lot of examples for you to not need to write an f and a g in there. And you should just be able to kind of identify which one's first, which one's second, and where do things go in your product rule. So the product rule says take the derivative of the first. So the derivative of x squared is 2x. That's from your power rule. And then it says times g. Remember, it was f prime g plus f g prime. And so it's just something to keep in mind. Whenever you see an f and a g that don't have a prime with them, you don't need to take a derivative. You're literally just copying and pasting what was there at the beginning. So this is your f prime. And then times g. Well, g is just e to the x. So no need to take any derivatives in there anywhere, although e to the x is its own derivative anyways. But this is just g. Now we need plus f, just copy and paste f, which is x squared, and then the derivative of g. Now again, e to the x is its own derivative. So even though e to the x shows up in here twice, one of them is from copying and pasting the function g, the other one is from taking the derivative of g, but that function is its own derivative. So this is what you would get right there. If you want, you could factor out an e to the x and just make this look a little simpler, but it's not needed. Okay, you could write it like this, and that would be the same thing there. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that if you have a constant multiplier, that's actually kind of the same thing as using a product rule, and it's not wrong. It's just a little more work than is necessary. So let's take a look at an example that we could have seen earlier in the last section. Something like 4 times x to the 5th. Okay, now this is a constant multiplier. I hope you should be able to know how to find the derivative of this anyways. We should just double check it with what we already know, because f prime should be 20x to the 4th. That's what we should end up with. But let's say you saw this and you said, hey, there's a product, one thing times another. Should I use a product rule to find f prime of x? Okay, it's nice to know that that wouldn't be wrong. It's just extra work than is what's needed. Okay, because if you use a product rule, you're taking the derivative of the first. And what's the derivative of a constant again? Oh yeah, that's 0. So the derivative of a constant times x to the 5th plus the first times the derivative of the second. The derivative of x to the 5th is 5x to the 4th. And so even in this case, you didn't need to use a product rule, but 0 times x to the 5th is still just 0. You still get 20x to the 4th there. Even if you tried to use a product rule, you made it more complicated than it needed to be, but it's not wrong. So good to just be able to check, because if this is a rule that's supposed to work, it should work even if our function f, that's our first function, like f and g, if our first function is just a constant, it should still work. It's just not needed. Okay, let's take a look at one last example. So let's have something like this. F of x equals 2 to the x over x to the 3rd plus 1. Okay, so again, not every problem is going to tell you need to use a quotient rule or you need to use a product rule. You should just be able to see the division here and say, oh, I have a function that has a fraction, I need to use a quotient rule. So remember what the quotient rule says? It says f prime g minus f g prime over g squared, and this was assuming that the original looked like f over g. Okay, so you can think top and bottom if you want. If it's confusing to see f and g, because I called this function f over here on the left, if that's confusing, you can think about it as top and bottom, whatever you want to do there. But when you're taking the derivative of this thing, you should have the derivative of the top. Remember, the derivative of the top is 2 raised to the x times the natural log of 2. Don't forget that natural log of 2 in there. And so there's the derivative of the top times the bottom. Don't forget parentheses. Times the bottom minus the top. Just copy and paste the top. Times the derivative of the bottom. The derivative of the bottom is 3x squared. And really, technically, it's like 3x squared plus 0, because the derivative of 1 on the end is 0. But you don't need to write plus 0. That's fine. And then divided by x to the third plus 1. And then don't forget, it's not just g on the bottom, it's g squared. Okay, so if you can remember your rules, I don't think they're too bad. I will say that I think the hardest part for students is not always using the rule. The hardest part is identifying that you need to use the rule. So if you can remember the rule, remember the formula, that's fine. But if you can't actually identify, hey, this is a fraction, I need a quotient rule, then knowing what the rule looks like doesn't do you any good. You need to know when to use the rule and be able to identify, oh, I have a product, I need to use a product rule. Oh, I have a quotient, I need to use a quotient rule. Okay, so that can be the hardest part. I would highly, highly, highly recommend practicing these a lot, just to get down the formula, but then also just to recognize when to use these. Okay, hope you've enjoyed the video. Good luck practicing.